Hi there. I'm here to narrate this video on Unreliable Narrators. You can trust everything I'm telling you. Hey guys, and welcome to this 5 Top Tips mini episode of Loud Poets Happy Hour. I'm Dr. Katie Ailes. I'm the host of Happy Hour, which is our show in which we take on poetry challenges, give you guys some guidance on how to complete them, share our work, and chat about all of it with you. Our current challenge, proposed by one of our fantastic Patreon supporters, is to write a poem with an unreliable narrator. To watch the full episode in which this challenge was proposed, you can follow the link in the eye, and please do like this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. You can also watch all of the videos in the Happy Hour series by checking out the playlist linked below. In this video, I'm going to give you examples, ideas, and advice to use unreliable narration in your own writing. Everything that I mention will be linked in the description below. So let's get to it, and let's start here. First things first, what is an unreliable narrator? When a piece of writing or film has an unreliable narrator, that means that you as the reader or viewer can't fully trust the information you're being told. It's false, incomplete, or otherwise doesn't fully accurately represent the actual events going on inside the narrator's world. For a famous example, take the narrator of The Yellow Wallpaper, the classic 1892 proto-feminist short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In this story, the narrator is a woman undergoing what is most likely postpartum depression. Her doctor husband prescribes her a rest cure, which basically consists of confining her to a dilapidated nursery in an old mansion because, being locked in a room by yourself with no distractions is great for that old mental health. The narrator becomes obsessed with the yellow wallpaper lining the room and gradually becomes convinced that there's a woman trapped inside the wallpaper who she needs to rescue by scratching away at it. By the end of the story, she's crawling around the completely destroyed room, triumphantly announcing, "I've got out at last." One way of interpreting this story is that it's science fiction and that there actually is a woman trapped in the wallpaper who then escapes and possesses the narrator. But the more common interpretation is that the narrator's confinement has driven her to perceive things that aren't real. Importantly, the narrator of The Yellow Wallpaper isn't a baddie. Her unreliability is rooted in her trauma, not any villainy. And this leads to an important point. In literature and film, unreliable narrators are not necessarily good or evil. They're just unreliable. Sometimes they are villainous, tricking the reader through intentionally setting up false pretenses. Gillian Flynn's best-selling novel and now film Gone Girl does this masterfully. But just as often, unreliable narrators are simply individuals with a different understanding of the world, due to trauma, mental illness, even youth, who aren't intentionally trying to deceive. They are accurately representing to the reader what they are perceiving. It's just that what they're perceiving is somewhat different from our perception of reality. If you want to learn more about this, the author William Riggin has theorized 4 different types of first-person unreliable narrators that are commonly seen in literature, and I've linked to his book below. My first tip here is that when you're writing poetry with unreliable narrators, keep in mind the breadth of options available to you, and that your narrator doesn't have to be a baddie. For another great example of a non-villainous unreliable narrator, watch this. If you've spent any time in the Scottish spoken word scene, you will be aware of the inimitable Sam Small. He is an absolutely brilliant poet and publisher and organizer of events. And the poem that I want to share with you now is called You Kept My Heart in a Jar in the Fridge. And it was published in Pure Toilet, his collection with speculative books, which came out in 2017. Sam actually performed this poem at the launch of Loud Poets Glasgow all the way back in 2015, and we have footage of that, which I've linked in the description below. Spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about the full poem now. This poem is, at its heart, a love poem, albeit a seriously warped one. It begins by sharing what seems like a complicated but fairly normal relationship, and then gradually drips more and more details that tell us that the narrator's fiancé is a serial killer. By the end, we learned that the fiancé has killed the narrator and chopped out his heart, put it in a jar, and stored it in the fridge. Ah, love. So in this poem, the narrator is unreliable on a couple of different levels. First, and most obviously, he's been dead the entire time. Bros pulled Bruce Willis. Another facet of the poem that makes the narrator unreliable is the fact that he's in love. And as he admits, love makes you silly, stupid, sick, and blind. He is definitely not objective about his fiancée. She is straight up murdering people, and he's just brushing it off and trying to ignore it. So although she's the serial killer, his grip on reality ain't too solid either. And third, the narrator is directly lying to the reader or to the audience here. He's making statements like, "We're getting married in September," which lead us to think that he's alive when he's, well, refrigerated. To put on my doctor cap for a second, I actually analyzed this poem as part of my PhD when I was looking at authenticity and truth-telling in spoken word. Spoken word poetry is great for playing with unreliable narration because you can really take advantage of the audience's expectations that everything that they hear on stage will be authentic and true. In spoken word, generally the audience assumes that the person on stage is telling true autobiographical stories, that their narration will be reliable. And this is what makes Sam's poem so startling and funny. The friction between our expectations that it's a true story about a rocky relationship and then our gradual realization that, oh, no, there is no way that this is true, and it's okay to laugh. So the takeaway here is to consider the medium that you're working in, whether it's spoken word or page poetry or a different medium altogether. Think about what the audience or the reader expects from the narrator, and then consider how can you either take advantage of or undermine these expectations. And speaking of keeping hearts in odd places, read this. That's right, it's Edgar Allan Poe time. You can't talk about unreliable narrators without mentioning this absolute master of the technique. So many of Poe's short stories and poems derive their horror from the fact that we can't really trust what the narrator is telling us. For example, the narrator of The Telltale Heart is hell-bent on a mission to destroy the evil, evil eyeball of the nice old man, which must be destroyed because it is evil. Or is it just a blind eye and this narrator needs some serious therapy and also maybe a hearing test because the heart under the floorboards definitely isn't beating anymore and is probably just a manifestation of his murder guilt? Arguably, Poe's most famous poem is also one of the best examples of unreliable narration, his poem The Raven, which you can hear the incredible and much missed Christopher Lee reading through this link. As many readers and scholars have debated over the years, there are a lot of different ways to interpret this poem. Is it a science fiction poem featuring a very wise, weird talking bird? Is the narrator hallucinating the raven or dreaming about it? Is the raven a metaphor for grief? Is it all of the above? In The Raven, it becomes gradually more apparent that the narrator is not okay, as his behavior goes from relatively rational to pretty unhinged. There is a slow erosion of his reliability. Sam Small's poem takes a similar tactic, with hints of unreliability dribbled throughout, but the big reveal that he's dead coming at the very end. But that's not the only approach to this technique. You could instead establish the unreliability of the narrator from the very start. You might begin with the line like, "Don't trust anything I say here," or "Very real things that happened on my acid trip," or "Hi, I'm the Prime Minister." If you establish from the start that the narration is unreliable, the reader will wonder at every turn whether they should trust what they're being told, which is a fantastic source of narrative tension. On the other hand, if you wait until the very end to reveal that the narrator's been unreliable, the reader will go, "Oh," and probably want to immediately go back to the beginning and reread now that they know the big twist. The takeaway here, there are many options for where in your poem you reveal that the narrator is unreliable. Try playing with a few. And for oh so many big twists, it's time to look elsewhere. Unreliable narration can exist in any form of creative writing, but it really hits its stride with the novel. So many of the most acclaimed examples of unreliable narrators come from novels written anywhere between the late 19th century through today. And interestingly, many of these novels have been made into very successful films, indicating that the unreliable narrator trope isn't just a great literary device, but works very well on screen too. Just some of the novels made into fantastic films with unreliable narrators include Fight Club, Gone Girl, American Psycho, Life of Pi, Room, and A Clockwork Orange. You may notice that all of these novels and films have aspects of horror in them. Whether the evil comes from the narrator themselves, from an external villain like an abuser, or from an external force more broadly, like capitalism. And in addition to the horror, and often intertwined with it, there's generally an aspect of dark comedy in these pieces as well. The connection between horror, comedy, and unreliable narration isn't coincidental. All three are rooted in the unexpected, in not knowing who to trust or how a situation will pan out, whether it ends up hilarious or very, very dark, or some combination of the two. It's also arguably easier to step out with the bounds of reality in these genres. Often in horror or comedy, we're okay with the hyperbolic, the extreme, the unreal. And so having an unreliable narrator who you can't trust works actually quite well in these genres. So when you're writing unreliable narrators, consider what genre would best convey the story that you're trying to tell, and maybe give horror and/or comedy a go. All right, things are going to get a little bit trippy for my last tip. And remember, one of the reasons unreliable narration lends itself so well to the horror genre is because it reminds us of an uneasy and potentially terrifying truth about existence. We perceive the world through our own inherently limited senses, our own blinkers, our own biases. And when we tell stories, we're only able to tell our own version of what's happened. So even if we're earnestly telling the truth, we can only ever tell our truth. Unreliable narration in creative writing and films remind us of how unreliable all storytelling is, and indeed how unreliable all perception is. When you get down to brass tacks, there's no such thing as reliable narration, because there's no such thing as objective reality. And other fun facts from my acid trip. The mind-bending nature of unreliable narration is a fantastic tool to toy with your reader's expectations and also to encourage a little bit more skepticism and maybe not to immediately trust everything that we're told. And conversely, the fun for readers is in trying to figure out your relationship with the narrator of the text. Is it one of intimacy and trust, or are you maybe holding them at a distance, trying to figure out whether you can actually believe what they're telling you? The power here is in the friction between the facts and the fiction, and making the reader invested in trying to figure out the truth, if there is any. So my final tip for writing unreliable narrators is to consider, what kind of relationship do you want your reader to have with your narrator? Do you want your reader to empathize with them or pity them? Or to be horrified with them, disgusted by them? Or maybe is it some ethically swirly combination of all the above? Unreliable narrators can be great sources of moral ambiguity, people who make seriously complex and maybe untrustworthy decisions, but are nonetheless worthy of the reader's empathy. Above all, I encourage you to experiment. Unreliable narration is one of these amazing literary devices that there are so many different ways that you can go about it, each with radically different results. So really play around with the different approaches that I've outlined in this video and enjoy it. And that is all for my 5 top tips on writing unreliable narrators. Guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. Honestly, it means the world. Please do stay tuned to see how we get on with this challenge. Next Thursday, I will be checking in with Beck Sherwood, who is back at Happy Hour, hallelujah, to see how she is getting on with this challenge. And then on Sunday the 20th, we will be releasing our full episode with all of the poems created through this challenge. Remember that to support our work and also to be able to submit your own challenges for us to write towards, you can sign up to our Patreon for as little as £1 a month. This also supports the work that we're currently doing towards making our YouTube channel more accessible through closed captioning. Please do like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell icon so that you don't miss any poetic goodness. Thank you guys again for watching. Your support really does mean the world to us, and happy writing.